Thank you.
Thanks very much. And thank you all once again. I think the majority of you joined us at our previous meeting where we were hopelessly overstretched for time. And I've got to say that I was quite happy that it worked out, that we were able then to split this discussion from the housing discussion that it was previously linked with. And that housing thing really, of course, was so big that it ate up all our time. I'm also then making the assumption that the majority of people saw the broader presentation that I gave, that gave spatial context to all of this. And I suppose if it becomes necessary, we can refer back to that. But what I'd like to do is share my screen then. And given that we now have a more comprehensive amount of time to address these very important issues of social infrastructure, and bearing in mind that it's one of our very important ambitions that social infrastructure gets developed and delivered as part of the urban delivery process, and not something that happens well after the event of communities ending up in this area. I'll just share my screen in a moment. I'll need to know whether you see it. Is that visible to you?
Yes, we can see that.
And my cursor is on that screen there, is it?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, then I'll go to, and I've taken the opportunity, because it's a more focused discussion now around social facilities, to talk more broadly than we would have had time at the last presentation as well. Nevertheless, it's still probably too extensive and too wordy, and so I will try and really cover it more on the basis of the argument line and the headlines of the thing, and then we can come back to detail in discussion. But the essence of the issue for me seems to be, and we know that CSR are all the different agencies in local authorities, we know all the agencies in province. These are all issues that come back over and over again and get revisited, and a lot of very good work over many, many decades that I've been involved in planning have seen evolution. But nevertheless, we still sit in many respects with this idea of a normative approach to how you provide for facilities in developments, whether they're small-scale townships done on a piecemeal one-on-one basis, or whether they're part of a big, rational, comprehensive planning operation as we are involved with here. But really, that normative basis always says we're going to set out to provide a comprehensive range of facilities, and the number of each of those facilities will usually be based on a per capita basis of population or a number of dwellings, and dwellings, not households. Of course, we always think of a dwelling as one family in one house. In fact, there can very often be one dwelling with several families in them. So it's always difficult to know the difference between dwellings and households. And then we tend to then set space standards for each of these kind of facilities, depending on the number that we'll use. And then we multiply that to come to a number. At the same time, though, one doesn't really address all these facility provisions on any rational basis of distribution. In a sense, it's almost you take what's left over almost. So it's always done on a case-by-case basis. It's not particularly reviewed in terms of distribution and access to the broader plan, and it's typically not being based generally on clustering, overlapping, or sharing of facilities. And really, it has nothing to do with on what basis facilities actually get delivered and who is going to deliver those. And those seem to me to be terribly important things that have to be dealt with here as well, particularly in a smart city and particularly at the scale that we're working at. But I've got to say that too often I've seen facilities end up being governed around that basis of slope, SLOAP, which is space left over after planning. You kind of do these plans and then you start to squirrel away and find out the least important pieces of ground that you can throw away, and those get assigned to open space or various kinds of facilities, etc. It's a bit like that idea of a student digs, where the first one out is best dressed. and somehow the facilities are always the last students out who are the worst dressed. And the other real problem we sit with is that we know going forward with sustainability, one of the most fundamental things is achieving sustainable densities. And so as much as we try and bump up our net residential densities through new housing typologies and looking for the efficiencies of how we service those higher densities, etc. If we look at, let's say, 20,000 dwelling units, and we're going to achieve a United Nations sort of guideline norm of 150 dwelling units a hectare, which is a relatively high density and certainly aimed at sustainability. Then on that basis, we're going to need 1,335 hectares of land to house those 20,000 dwellings, all right? But then and we'll just use schools because they're always the benchmark in many respects. And if you were to follow nominal guidelines, and these things change from time to time and they get rethought, but that nominal thing always fundamentally still settles in and around this idea as a guideline of about one primary school per 400 dwellings and one secondary school per 800 dwellings. And then a primary school will be 2.5 hectares and a high school will be 4 hectares kind of thing. And that means that for the 50 primary schools you're going to need, and for the 25 secondary schools you need another 225 hectares on top of the 1,335 hectares that mentioned earlier. So our gross area required then, just in respect of schools, for example, would be over 1,500 hectares on that basis. And you can see then, if you work that out, in fact, your actual gross density that you're achieving, notwithstanding these very high net densities, your gross density drops to 128 units per hectare. So give or take, it's about 130 hectares. And that's in respect then of the school component only, before you've spoken about open space standards, all kinds of other community facilities, all other kinds of contributions to cemeteries and various other regional things as well, and hospitals and so on. So you can see that no matter how high we push these net densities of sustainability, we're still always pulling it back to a more pedestrian kind of density when we factor in the way normatively we tend to approach facilities. And then, of course, there's the other aspect, is what are we actually doing when we provide those facilities? And a random scan, and you all know this, as you look across all these sites that have been left, you'll see that most of them are either vacant or undeveloped or underdeveloped. And in all of that, then, you also see that we've always allowed a school to have various sports facilities, etc. In the majority of cases, these people can't afford those facilities and they don't get provided as part of the school. And so we know there's this very patchy and uneven way of dealing with things. We get some schools clustered together, but you can see a lot of the land lies around, not just baggy, but it actually becomes negative space because it becomes socially fallow, it becomes a dumping ground, and it actually quite often becomes very dangerous in all of this. And so in a way, these things become anti-community and anti-urban if we're not careful about it. And so we tend to always end up with a lot of our facilities, whether they're schools or other kind of community facilities, sitting in a way in splendid isolation from the rest of the community around them because we're reserving land. We're doing the right thing, reserving land. But the question is, are we actually doing anything? So what we tend to note, of course, is that the take-up of sites is very small in relation to the number of sites actually provided on this normative basis. And where they are taken up, they are used very little, or the site is underutilized. And so where a school and associated sports facilities have been taken up, actually it's very hard. If you look at libraries, if you look at the actual sports facilities, if you look at the school hall itself, apart from assemblies, etc., it's very hard to make an argument taken over a full year, bearing in mind not just over the academic year, of these facilities being used for much more than about 5% of any given year. And yet they are locked up, in a sense, with those schools, the way we go about these things. And then, of course, there are some that just never get taken up at all, as I say, and sit around in a fallow way. So in effect, facilities can't be built, equipped and staffed at anywhere near the level of the site provision we make for them. The majority of sports and other facilities associated with schools have to be provided and maintained by the community, who are generally very ill-equipped to be able to do that. The communities that rely on school provision on the basis of sites provided are unable to afford both the facilities and their maintenance. And of course, we see with schools that were taken over in the democratic era that a lot of schools actually, their facilities have become either redundant or unutilized. And where facilities are provided in wealthier communities, the associated facilities are, to all intents and purposes, privatized and can't be used by a wider community, because these communities are then saying, we've provided that for our school and we're not going to share it with any wider community. And so in all of this, though, we give ourselves that warm feeling that as planners, we've done what we had to do. We've done our bit by making provision for the future. The rest of who provides it, how it's provided, how it's maintained, whether it's provided at all, that's not our concern. We've done our bit. We provided for it. And that's not a good enough thing. That's in a crude way, it's like a businessman in a dark suit in a meeting wetting his pants. Nobody else notices, and he's the only one who gets the warm feeling. It's not good enough. We've got to do better than that. So we have to ask ourselves, are we doing anything worthwhile? We're left with all this vacant land, it's socially fallow, etc. All those points I've made already. But more worrying, of course, is the fact that while we're trying to achieve urban compaction and complexity, we're trying to make these densities higher, but we're actually getting something that is really a kind of a model that keeps driving us back to suburbia. And in a way, this whole normative way of thinking about facilities always has been driven out of a kind of a suburban mindset, even in dormitory townships, far-flung from the rest of cities, where primarily the only use there is a residential one. We still think of it in suburban terms rather than in urban terms. And we've never, ever come close to this idea of embracing urban facilities the way we see them in, let's say, a lot of the older European cities, a lot of cities across the world, in the Far East and in South America, for example, where you really get schools that are sized appropriately around the nature of the urban environments they fit into. That discussion really doesn't ever make it onto the table in the South African context, has been my experience. And if people have other experiences, I clearly want to be able to discuss that and hear about that. But I think the fundamental contention is we're stuck in a kind of a suburban mindset when we think of this, and that's not what the smart city is about. So we want to then look at this idea of how can we make facilities and where people are tasked with making those things available. I think I mentioned at a previous meeting, if you took the new public housing that's gone into the Cornubia area north of eThekwini, across the way from the Mhlanga Ridge Town Centre, there are communities there that have been there for the better part now of about, I suppose, 5 or 6 years. The closest school is still about 3 main roads away, and as far as I remember, there are 3 deaths from children having to cross these main roads in that 6-year period. And so that's clearly just a sad, sad indictment of everything. We also know that we're making facilities available very often for apparent agencies that are going to come and develop things, but they don't actually, there is no agency that does that. For example, if you look at creches or places of worship or homes for the aged, children's homes, many of those things actually aren't provided by by statutory agencies. They're provided by NGOs or social societies or faith-based groups, or indeed the private sector. Virtually all creches in the end are developed by people somehow in their own home or in their own apartment or whatever it is. It's done on an as-needed basis, and in many respects is almost market-driven. And yet those are all facilities that we keep making provision for in this normative kind of model. And then, of course, you get a private school who has to go and assemble their own site somewhere else where it happens to suit them. And of course, it's not going to be a facility that works well for a broader community. And those sites aren't provided for, and they don't have access to those sites that have been provided for. So all in all, it looks like facilities are provided well after there's been a need identified, and you wait until there's a pressure, and pressure builds, and in the end you get in a facility when one facility is either overstretched or overstressed, or else it's done on some sort of a crisis management basis where on the squeaky wheel. It's always the squeaky wheel that gets the oil. And so when a community comes out in anger and in protesting, etc., that tends to get people's attention, and one rattles around trying to look for how to provide for those inefficiencies. And there doesn't appear to be any early warning system that's telling anyone about this. Everybody, it's like they're waking up to this for the first time whenever there's a new demonstration or a main road gets blocked because of community action. And there's little match-up between making facilities available as sites and then making provision for building, equipping, staffing, and managing them. And of course, they're always different people in different silos looking at all of these things. So there's no requirement for a particular facility agency to meet objectives in any respect. And of course, no one's looking at the synergy between all of these facilities. And a great case in point, in my very limited working life has been, for example, a municipality will provide a clinic. We want that clinic placed on one of the market squares that we've included in our urban design, and we're very happy to have this clinic that arrives, except when the clinic arrives, it's actually put away from the market square on the back of the site, and a big razor wire fence goes up around the perimeter of that site. Now, you've got people who come to these clinics day after day. You don't phone for an appointment. You don't arrive at a time and get seen. You come in the morning, you sit and you wait, and you might well come back the next day because you weren't seen the day before. We're talking about people who are sitting around. They are forced to have time on their hands. They can become part of a productive kind of other world of things that happen in marketplaces. And yet, the way we keep we assume that the only objective of a clinic is to provide clinic facilities to a community. We don't see that there are other objectives to be met by that clinic in the way that they interact and add synergy to broader nodes and clusters of things, for example, around a market square. And that is just a dumb way of thinking about things as well. So reality does show us that there's merit in the just-in-time delivery approach, because you don't want to roll these things out and have them standing around and getting vandalized by being vacant. But and the provision really has to somehow be tailor-made each time to what is required by that community as a whole, not simply around just this idea of we provide a school or a creche or a clinic. And our present approach seems to be an unattainable, inappropriate, and unsustainable model. And again, these are all, I suppose, things that are constantly debated. We've all been involved in these debates for many, many years, but it seems to us with this Smart City initiative that there's a real chance of looking at something more than. So we seem to be out of step with reality, in my view, and yet the way we end up delivering services still seems to be wholly inadequate, notwithstanding how much provision we make for it. And it seems that we need a rethink, and that's why I think this is a good time to be talking about it. So I think as has always been the case, we need to look at this issue of the rate of provision, and I seriously wouldn't underestimate. It's correct to know that we need these things in advance and we need the guidelines to those sort of things. But I think we have to be a bit more realistic about that, and we have to remember that there are guidelines rather than standards, or they should rather be guidelines. And then I do think we get it hopelessly wrong in many respects around the site sizes, because that's where we really don't understand context or synergy at a bigger scale, because we think of these things in silos only all the time. And so it seems to us that some of the most profound changes must be found in the principles of how do we cluster facilities, how do we share facilities, and how do we overlap facilities. And I'm talking about this is one facility to another, but of course it's also one facility to a community, rather than just saying this is a school for the people who use the school, as opposed to it's a community facility used by all and happens to also provide schooling to that community. So these are all our kind of shortfalls in my view, and how do we get beyond that to a set of alternative propositions. And so those alternative propositions we'd like to suggest here would be that we regard them, as I say, as guidelines rather than standards, that we prepare a flexible approach that is based on these guidelines, but we rather look for the kind of early warning that goes with performance criteria. And so that as we are planning certain things, we know the performance criteria of planning those things also requires other knock-ons that have to be met. And we've got to accept these principles of clustering, sharing, and overlapping. We delink the open space sports facility component, in my view, away from the school. We say the school is there to deal with this issue of education. To the extent that education takes place around sport, which is a very important thing, there should be a way of overlapping that use by using other community facilities which aren't just sports facilities dedicated to that school alone. And we reserve sites for things in such a way that we can use them in the meantime. How do we start developing things that are simply held on some sort of a lease basis, sometimes a long lease until it's going to be ready, but what is getting developed on that site might well be developed in such a way that it's fit for purpose when we want to convert it into a clinic or a school or whatever it might be. And so there might be ways, for example, of mini factories and warehousing going onto a site on a leased basis until such time as a school might be required. It's very easy to find these standards that repurpose and find, if you like, the one-size-fits-all resilient model. And we impose very limited constraints on that. Too often these things come out of an agency that has developed a pro forma way of doing things, and they become these cookie-cutter things that mean we're still thinking of things as a ring-fence site in suburbia to meet a suburban kind of lifestyle. Whereas if we were looking at it on a basis of if you like, the merits of each case in an urban situation, how would we respond with that, and how would we find other very interesting link-ons, both economically and socially, around those sort of things. We need an early warning system, definitely, and that is hugely important in all of this. And we need to provide needs in a way that they're committed on a just-in-time basis, but that we have a very clear idea of what that assessed delivery capacity is. And in a sense, I suppose we're moving to this idea, as we are with service infrastructure, that while DBSA is looking at models of a special purpose vehicle and funding and financing mechanisms that deal with whole new and more appropriate ways of approaching infrastructural investment for services, we need, in a sense, to have that same kind of SPV that thinks about the delivery of social infrastructure as well. And that SPV, of course, would have the task of having the early warning system in place, of knowing that how it interfaces with the bigger planning thing, to know what is coming down the line, to have the agencies already lined up so that if and when a school site is required, it's also going to be ready to receive a school in a bricks and mortar terms. There are going to be teachers available to that. There are going to be desks, books, etc. that go with all of that. And very importantly, there are going to be sports facilities and things at a community-based level close by that can be networked with all of these things as well. And so that is where we start, I think, in the, if you like, modeling space around this idea. There we have the most important ergonomic in urban development, and it's the 10-minute walk from that point to the outer. So you effectively, a 20-minute walk right across this area would give you a 5-minute walk, and you get a series of these overlapping 5-minute walks, all right? And then we know the sweet spot of this whole thing, of course, is at the core of that, with its 5-minute walk relative to that. And that's really where all our thinking needs to start around these ideas, and how we then look for insertion into our smart city. And what we then want to do is say, how do we create what I've referred to as a primary community installation? So this isn't about schools yet. This is about what are the things that that community living within this 10-minute walk all need. And that will be, in size terms, 2 full soccer fields or 4 junior fields, 1 full rugby field or 2 junior rugby fields superimposed in all of that. And a cricket oval with nets superimposed on that, and a 400-meter athletics track and field oval superimposed on that, with a swimming complex, which would have a training pool, would have the intermediate pool, and have the toddlers pool, and a hard court area of 4 tennis courts and netball and basket superimposed on all of that. That's what you would have in a primary community installation. That would seem to be what that 10-minute walk, being 20 minutes across, would want. And then, of course, you're going to need the community hall, the library, the indoor sports, things that go with that, change facilities, meeting rooms, community rooms, storage, all of those things. Then you're going to be able to think about what I've referred to as education modular sites, an EMS. And that is to say that you would have a basic module for education. There would be one of those modules for a primary school, and for a high school or a secondary school, you would have 2 modules of that. And on that basis, you would then start to think about what are the things you're going to be looking to provide, and in the early stages, what are those things? So you're going to want early on, in an initial kind of development, you're going to want a community hall, a library, and a clinic. You're going to want a secondary school, a primary school. You're going to want potentially a place of worship, but you're going to need sports facilities, play lots, local parks. All those things, like a cemetery, gets handled quite separately, and it's not necessarily going to come out of this budget. We've got a bigger region that we're part of here, and that gets thought of separately. But you would also certainly be looking at big Eskom power line servitudes, etc., to try and overlap those to get more efficient use out of space. Things like a larger community health center with ARV, all of those sorts of things might well, in fact, be things that you'd rather place in a far more accessible, broader regional sense within a city center. And so you would be thinking of that not as a facility to be provided in a housing program, but actually part of a city program. And so you wouldn't be thinking of a civic center every time you do a whole chunk of this, because there's going to be a civic center embedded with the city center itself. And so that's how we would be thinking about it. And what we would be most interested in then at the early local scales of providing this higher density housing, which is indeed integral anyway with the bigger city center initiative, would be that you want a primary community installation, which were on the basis that I've already discussed, that would cover a community hall, a library, a clinic, so that a school itself doesn't need to have its own library. It doesn't need to have its own community hall. It can, in fact, share those kinds of facilities. And then, because you put things close enough, you can have a secondary school and a primary school based on this education modular basis, which then all connect into this, so that a community hall, library, clinic, sports facilities can all get provided through the primary community installation. And then that would give you, on the basis of these 2,000 dwellings that we're talking about, you would need, on the 20,000 dwellings, you would have 8 of those sites, and then you would have 8 education modular sites that would cover the educational things linked with the primary thing. And then that would be secondary schools and primary schools taking that up. And all of that's not too important for discussion, other than for principle at the moment and discussion. And then, of course, all the time you're trotting out play lots, local parks and things as you design these things. So here we would have a typical primary community installation. This would be, if you had to take 175 meters by 175 meters, that would be a site that gets all this done. And rather than just finding some arbitrary place which is left over after planning, you start to insert these things at the core of very important places. They become focal points. And that's going to provide us with those sports fields we needed, the cricket oval overlapping that, and you can see that 400-meter track in black outline there as well, included in all of that. Then on a piece of 65 by 50, we have the hard court facilities, and on a 40 by 50 piece, we have those 3 levels of water-based recreation that we've spoken about. And then, of course, you have the community hall, which doubles up with internal sports facilities, as well as drama and everything else that happens, and community meetings. Then you have change rooms and storage, you have a clinic, you have a library, and you have meeting rooms and community contact place. And all of that is capable. Now, it's not a question of whether it's exactly 175 by 175, but it's the indication of thought that says that for a very concentrated piece of design, you can make an appropriate piece of site available for that. And that becomes the guideline of, because very importantly, then you're going to be sharing with an education module. And an education module in this case would be 60 meters by 60 meters. That's really 3,600 square meters. There's not even half a hectare yet. And you're going to have in a 30 by 8 module of building, you're going to set up effectively a quadrangular school with access at those corners all around the school quadrangle. And of course, you've got then a 10 by 8 module, a double module for a classroom. And you've got 3 classrooms per block on that basis, which is 12 classrooms per level, which is 24 classrooms on 2 levels. And of course, the way the stairs and everything are set up, it allows a principal or whoever to preside over that square and run assembly, etc. in that quadrangle. You then have provision for parking. You've got provision for administration. You've got provision for the laboratories, computer and media centers, and you've got provision for ablutions and storage. And then you've got a 40 square meter module, which gives you 48 units on 2 levels. and it allows you then to effectively use these as mini warehouses if you want to, for developing stuff that can be leased, and then when you need it as a school, it can be taken back into a school system because you're ready for that school, and it's effectively on hand because you've had this available on a short lease basis. And then it's possible to start looking at how, at a bigger scale, you overlap and cluster and consolidate around these primary community installations and the school installations within all of those, and looking at how you get to open space. We've done this quite successfully in an Oakland City project in the Western Cape, which unfortunately has not gone ahead yet. It's tied up in court for other matters, but we were able to get to a general understanding of this as an approach. It's been applied looking at Frankenwald now. Again, that hasn't been finalized and consolidated, but it's indicative of process. So I think it's the fundamental precept is also to understand that we're not just another township, we're not just another developer coming to, in this case, a city council, for example, or going to province about future schools. We're talking about a broad integrated system of many things, and one of the most extraordinary things that's available to us in this smart city is that, and it came about through discussion with the Crocodile River Conservancy or the Crocodile River Reserve the other day, is this ability to think about how you can also manage offsets. Now, we're absolutely convinced and determined to work around watercourses, hydrological cycles, wetlands and all of that. But we also know that you can reserve a certain amount of facilities, particularly open space facilities, that can go into those kinds of reserves. And you can do it with the way that you handle drainage patterns, etc. And you can still keep the integrity of the water cycles within that. But what we also can do is that over scale, we can consolidate all the offsets we require because we want to reserve land not just being fallow and not just serving a single purpose of doing what a wetland needs to do, but we can think about it more holistically, and we can get offsets that can be consolidated very meaningfully, for example, in the Crocodile River Reserve, for example. So we have all these other abilities here to set up an SPV to manage this as a fundamentally understood pursuit of city building, and knowing that we can solve a lot of things regionally and then at a city scale as well because of the principles of offsetting, clustering, overlapping and sharing. And I think that's where I would leave it